Born on the 31st of January 1979 in the English county of Surrey, Ruth Wilson was the oldest daughter of parents Ian and Karen Wilson. The family lived on Wanham Lane in the small village of Betchworth, and both parents earned a living as teachers at local schools. Ruth was an impressively intelligent child who took to reading and learning musical instruments from a very early age, yet she also had a healthy social life and could be found hanging out with friends when she wasn't studying or working her Saturday job at a local music shop. Yet during the late autumn of 1995, when Ruth was 16 years old, a series of strange and tragic occurrences resulted in an eerie and enduring mystery. During the late summer of that year, Ruth's best friend Catherine delivered some bad news. She and her family were moving up to the city of Sheffield in South Yorkshire. Following the move, the girls missed each other terribly, so in late October or early November, Ruth traveled up to Sheffield for a sleepover. Catherine's mother recalled that the girls were overjoyed to be reunited and equally sad to part again. However, Ruth's reluctance to leave seemed somewhat unhealthy. She asked Catherine's mother if she could live with them, and when her request was refused, she seemed to be on the verge of tears. Catherine's mother then invited Ruth to discuss any problems that she might have with her home life, but she refused to say. Catherine's mom then contacted Ruth's parents, but they assured her that Ruth had no problems at home and simply missed her old friend. However, this wasn't strictly true. On Saturday, November 25th, 1995, Ruth worked her regular shift at the music shop and then went to get a bite to eat with a young man named Will Kennedy. Kennedy was an ex-boyfriend of Ruth's, but the pair maintained a healthy platonic friendship following their breakup. They were joined by a mutual friend named Neil Phillipson, and both boys later reported that Ruth paid for their food. Ruth was not a rich girl by any stretch of the imagination, so paying for their food marked an extravagant act of generosity from her. Both boys claimed that they were more than capable of paying for their own meals and had initially objected to Ruth's show of kindness, but she insisted, and in the end, they relented and allowed her to pay. The next day, Ruth attended orchestra practice at her local church and then visited Will Kennedy's home for dinner. Will's mother recalled how she seemed happy and healthy, but mentioned something rather curious. Before she departed, Ruth asked Mrs. Kennedy if she had any old clothes that she could borrow. Mrs. Kennedy thought that the request was odd, but took Ruth upstairs to her closet so she could pick out a few items. Ruth seemed extremely grateful, but didn't act in a way that raised any alarm bells, at least not according to Mrs. Kennedy. That Monday, the 27th of November, started much like any other for Ruth and her family. Her father and mother left for work early, leaving Ruth and her little sister, Jenny, to catch the bus to school. Yet just before the girls were due to leave, Ruth informed her little sister that she'd be walking to school alone. This wasn't entirely out of the ordinary, as by that point, Ruth was studying for her A-levels and thus had a much more flexible schedule when it came to classes. So, when Jenny left the house to walk to the bus stop, Ruth stayed home for a few more minutes before departing. Minutes later, Ruth was spotted by Will Kennedy, who was driving to school in a car that he'd been given as a reward for passing his driving test. He rolled down his window, got her attention, and then offered her a ride to school. Strangely, Ruth declined and told Will that she'd catch him at school later that morning. But Ruth never made it to school that day. In fact, her family and friends would never see her again. That evening, Ruth's parents arrived home to discover that she was nowhere to be found. They contacted her school, and once they discovered that she'd essentially been missing since 9:30 that morning, they contacted Surrey police to report her missing. In the hours that followed, and in conjunction with local radio and TV stations, law enforcement circulated numerous public appeals regarding Ruth's disappearance. They described her as wearing a red knitted jumper, black velvet trousers, black pixie boots, and a small lady's watch on her left wrist. Not long after the reports were circulated, a local cab driver contacted the police, claiming that Ruth had been one of his passengers. According to the driver, he'd driven her from the train station in nearby Dorking to a country park known as Box Hill. Box Hill is a small, steep, heavily wooded section of a rural area known as the North Downs. It has well-maintained walking trails, a parking lot, and even a small cafe, but despite being somewhat commercialized, it's one of the greener, more forested regions of the county. Why Ruth wanted to go to Box Hill is a mystery, but after dropping her off near a small riding path, the cab driver observed something strange. Instead of walking off to an intended destination, Ruth just stood there in the rain, looking lost and frightened. Having only lost sight of her for a moment, the driver decided to go back and check on Ruth to see if she was okay. But on his return, she was nowhere to be seen. Since it was raining, the driver didn't exit his vehicle to search for Ruth on foot, but he later said that he was quite certain that she wasn't on the riding path, and nor could she have been walking on any of the nearby sidewalks, or he'd most likely have spotted her. This is the last known sighting anyone had of Ruth. After that, it's like she dropped off the face of the earth. That night, Surrey police conducted a comprehensive and wide-reaching search of the area surrounding Box Hill. They utilized specialist tracker teams, sniffer dogs, and even helicopter teams equipped with heat-sensitive cameras. However, despite a solid 12 hours of non-stop searching, not a single trace of Ruth Wilson could be found. Officers then set about gathering as much intelligence as possible and questioned dozens of Ruth's friends, teachers, and family members. They discovered that Ruth visited Box Hill regularly and mostly did so alone. The police also found out that Ruth's grades had been slipping in the weeks before she disappeared. However, perhaps the most damning theory involves the Wilson family's deepest, darkest secret. The truth is, Karen Wilson was not Ruth's biological mother. Ruth's birth mother had passed away back in December of 1982, when Ruth was only barely 3 years old, and her father married Karen less than a year later. Ruth was aware that her birth mother had passed away when she was still a toddler, but was told that her passing was the result of a tragic accident. However, that wasn't true. Nesta Wilson's death had certainly been tragic, but it was very much intentional. The events leading up to her death aren't clear, but on December 10th of 1982, Nesta Wilson hung herself from a banister in the Wilson family home. Ruth's father found her, contacted emergency services, and then tried his utmost to ensure that his 2 young children knew nothing of their mother taking their own life. For 13 years, Ian Wilson ensured his daughters remained ignorant of her mother's true fate, yet the timing of her disappearance suggested that was no longer true. You see, Ruth vanished exactly 14 days before the anniversary of her mother's death. But if someone had secretly revealed the truth to her, who was it, and why had they done so? 2 days after Ruth went missing, an expensive-looking bouquet of flowers arrived at the Wilson house. They were addressed to her stepmother, Karen, but the attached note was left blank. The police traced the flowers to a florist on Dorking High Street, and after questioning the owner, they discovered that Ruth had placed the order on the day she went missing, instructing the florist not to deliver the bouquet until the 29th of November. It's not clear why they were addressed to her stepmother or what the intended message was. Some interpreted the gesture as some kind of insult, but there are far less expensive ways of showing someone disrespect. 2 days later, on December 1st, 1995, the police found 3 handwritten notes at the peak of Box Hill. They had been hidden in a bush, with one addressed to her father, another to her stepmother, and a third to her close friends. The handwriting matched Ruth's. Although the police wouldn't divulge the details of the notes, another nearby discovery became a cause for deep concern. The police had ruled out the possibility of the letters amounting to a 3-part note of her taking her own life, but they did admit to finding a half-empty liquor bottle and some empty packets of painkillers nearby. There was no evidence that these items belonged to Ruth, and nothing was missing from the Wilson family's home liquor cabinet. However, the find set the media ablaze with rumors. To rule out the possibility of her taking her own life, the local police conducted a second search of Ruth's last known whereabouts. They tailored their search plan to specifically look for dead bodies, using highly trained cadaver dogs to sniff around the areas where she had been spotted. However, once again, they came back with nothing. If Ruth had indeed taken her own life, whatever remained of her was definitely not in the vicinity of Box Hill. The search area was then expanded to include the vast majority of the surrounding countryside, but again, no trace of Ruth or her dead body was ever found. Mark Williams Thomas, the family liaison officer for the case, told the Wilsons that there was no evidence to suggest that Ruth had been murdered or that she had even taken her own life. He also made it clear that the police had ruled out the possibility of abduction. From my experience, I would suggest one of two things, he reportedly told them. She either went up there to meet someone and voluntarily disappeared, or she died up there, and I'm confident it wasn't the latter. 8 months after Ruth suddenly and inexplicably vanished, the investigation into her whereabouts took a very different turn. With a complete lack of evidence pointing to her death, those involved in the case became convinced that she was still alive. Her father and stepmother made numerous TV appearances, publicly stating that they believed Ruth was alive but too afraid to return home. Recent photographs were circulated, some with Ruth's hair tinted blonde or red to simulate what she might look like if she had dyed it. Sussex police made a 24-hour dedicated hotline, hoping that a tip might finally come in, but none ever came. Then one day, Ruth's old friend Catherine, the one whose house she wanted to move into, received a knock at the door of her family home. It was the police, and they had a search warrant. Catherine's family home was searched from top to bottom, and it became clear that the police suspected them of hiding her missing friend. Catherine Mayer's family found the accusation outrageous and asserted that they would have contacted Ruth's parents at the very first sign of her disappearance. They too were grieving her loss, and the implication of conspiracy was nothing short of insulting to them. Yet a few months later, there was yet another unexpected twist to the tale. Exactly 1 year to the day since Ruth's disappearance, a teenage girl with a short, cropped haircut walked into a convenience store just 2 miles from Box Hill. The girl was visibly distressed as she approached the shopkeeper, and in a trembling voice, she asked for a single copy of every newspaper they had available. The bemused shopkeeper pointed to an empty row of shelves next to the counter and explained that they had sold out during the late afternoon rush. The girl seemed frustrated to the point of tears, then rushed out of the shop again without another word. Naturally, such a bizarre interaction played on the shopkeeper's mind, and it was only when he spotted one of Ruth's missing posters that he realized why the girl seemed so familiar. He later told the police that, although he couldn't be certain, the girl who appeared in his store that day looked an awful lot like the missing teenager, Ruth Wilson. Officers managed to get their hands on a copy of the newspaper the girl was looking for, and just a few pages in, they found what they were looking for. The paper featured an article covering the 1-year anniversary of Ruth's disappearance. It covered most eventualities, but essentially came to the same conclusion as the police. Ruth was still alive. She had to be. The only question was, where? In an article from January 1997, both Ian and Karen Wilson stated that they believed Ruth was still alive and will continue to do so until proven otherwise. They believed the frightened, short-haired girl was Ruth and that she wanted to read up on the progress of her missing persons case. Hypothetically, if the girl was indeed Ruth, she might have wanted to check if people believed that she was dead or not. This raises a very pertinent question. What if the presence of the half-drunk liquor and empty pill packets was merely to make it look like she had taken her own life in the first place? What if Ruth isn't missing at all and has, in reality, faked her own death? 58-year-old retired police officer Liam McCulley once implied that Ruth's strange behavior after exiting the cab was due to the presence of a third party. In his opinion, she didn't want anyone seeing where she was going, and that's why Ruth waited until the cab was out of sight before making a move. But who might this third party be? And are they the same person who revealed the truth behind her mother taking her own life? In the years that followed, the sheer quantity of unanswered questions has caused Ruth's case to become a high-priority unsolved missing persons case. It is reviewed on a regular basis by DCI Alex Geldert, who has stated that the investigation will be reopened if any new evidence or lines of inquiry come to light. But until then, all we can do is hope and pray that wherever she is, Ruth Wilson is at peace. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.